issue of childcare on the show yesterday, and the phones started ringing off the hook, in particular over the outrageous cost of childcare across many parts of our big cities. Now, one caller even made the point, you might remember the call, that it had become uneconomical for his wife to stay in work. And she was in a pretty decent paying job because the childcare costs for their 3 children had become so onerous, it was actually costing her to go to work. Now, clearly this situation's madness, as is the fact that in some centres, it costs more annually to send a 3-year-old to childcare for 5 days a week than it does to send a 15-year-old to the top private high school in the city. Anyway, looking into what's driving all of this is the Senate Select Committee on Red Tape. And as we said yesterday, they've called for a review into the National Quality Framework, which basically is the thing that governs staffing ratios and qualifications in the childcare industry. Now, in its interim report, the Senate committee noted the evidence around both staffing ratios and required qualifications for childcare staff was questionable. The committee chairman is David Leyonhjelm, Senator from New South Wales, and he's now called for the National Quality Framework to be amended. And as he rightly says, the current standards impose unnecessary additional costs on childcare. The question is, though, is this where the real big costs come, or are they lurking elsewhere? Now, predictably, any determination or attempt to change the status quo has earned the ire of the unions and Labor. But I thought we'd speak to Senator Leyonhjelm. He joins me on the line. David, nice to talk again.
Hello, Mike.
Obviously, cost of living is, one of those really big issues that's honing in a lot of people's attention at the moment, be it about electricity, fuel, mortgage or whatever. But for many, one of the big cost of living pressures is childcare, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It concerns a lot of people with littlies, and obviously it has a big influence on their life because it can determine whether or not they can get back into the workforce as soon as they'd like to. A lot of people want to go back to the workforce because they want the intellectual stimulation and contact with adults, don't want to be around children all day, every day. Others just need to get back for the money. So childcare is very, very important to a lot of people.
Yes. Now, you're the Senate, or the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Red Tape. As I said, you've been looking into all of this. Your recommendation acknowledges, as far as I'm aware, that there is a rationale for imposing staff ratios and qualifications. But, as you said, you're not yet convinced that the current policy settings are correct. Do you want to flesh that out?
Yeah, one of the biggest influences on cost is the rules surrounding it, the National Quality Framework. There are a lot of rules, but probably the most influential ones are staff ratios, and they vary, of course, according to the number of little ones they have to look after, and the qualifications of those people who do the looking after of the little ones. When the National Quality Framework came in, there were quite a lot of very experienced long-term carers who actually lost their job because they didn't have a certificate in childcare, and the new rules required a qualification. So a lot of people couldn't keep doing what they'd been doing very, very well for a long period of time because of the new rules. And they were replaced by people with these qualifications. Now, the obvious thing is, as soon as you have a qualification, you say, well, I deserve a higher pay. So the childcare providers had to bump up their salaries. They're still not all that highly paid childcare workers, but they are pushing to get their pay up because of the qualification. And then, of course, as I said, the ratios of carers to kids is prescribed in the rules, and so there's a certain number of them that you actually have to employ.
Broadly, this has been a real mess for the government as well, because, as we've seen, Senator Birmingham, the Education Minister, has recently released a new funding formula to try to assist parents with the cost of childcare, acknowledging that it's a big problem. But like with the first homeowners schemes and all of these sort of things, the moment the government says, well, here's a pot of money and we're going to dole it out to you because you've got kids in childcare, all the operators do is increase their fees rather than keep fees stable and help parents absorb the cost. The government doesn't seem yet to be able to grasp, David, does it, that the more money they give to parents, the more the childcare operators will charge rather than the more it will help cost of living pressure?
Yeah, that's right. The Commonwealth Government didn't pay for childcare at all about a decade ago. And it's now costing, I think, close to $9 billion and heading up the fair old rate per year, $9 to $10 billion. It'll be, it's about $9 billion now. It'll be $10 billion very soon. that's an enormous amount of money out of the pockets of taxpayers that we weren't paying for just a decade ago. Now, so the question you have to ask yourself is, what public policy outcome is being achieved that justifies that sort of money?
Because all that money is not putting downward pressure on the per-hour cost for childcare. In fact, the opposite is occurring.
Yeah, that's right. It's not really working as a proper market should.
Yep.
You know, you would expect that as supply increased, as the number of childcare places increased, and the number of kids didn't increase at the same rate, that prices would fall. They're not doing that. It's such a highly regulated market. It's so distorted by government involvement that the market's not working the way it should be. The best illustration of that is, in fact, family daycare. Family daycare is different from the childcare sector in that it's home-based, and it's because they're not paying rent for premises, so forth, you would think that it ought to be, quite cheap. But it's not. It's pretty much the same cost as most childcare services, and the prices are going up. They're not going down. The government is really making a terrible mess of it. And of course, who's paying for all of that?
Taxpayers.
Taxpayers are paying for it.
Many of whom don't have children.
Many of whom don't have children. That's right. In fact, it's actually quite tragic in a way. You've got people who are taxpayers who would like to have children who can't. They're being taxed pretty heavily. Those taxes are going to pay for childcare. And I've likened it to someone in a wheelchair who can't walk having to pay for the sand shoes or the running shoes of an able-bodied person. You know, it really is quite cruel in a way. There is a public policy purpose to it, though, and that is getting people, mostly mothers,
back into
the workforce.
Yeah.
And there is also another public policy in that kids in really dysfunctional households, drug users, drinkers, dysfunctional is the best word for it, I think. Kids are actually better off in childcare. They do better if they have childcare and they're removed from those households at least for some hours a day.
That's a valid point. I mean, you did mention, though, David, that it is that scenario, the dysfunctional households aside. I mean, you did mention this is now a very highly regulated market. The alternative, though, is a completely unregulated market, and that is where the kids stay with grandma or grandpa or mum, sometimes dad, at home because they're not working. Now, what your committee report seems to have highlighted, and I think this is valid, is on the one hand you have an incredibly highly regulated, expensive market over here, and on the other hand you've got no regulations and it's basically it's free unless mum or dad or grandma or grandpa ask for a bit of money for petrol or something over there, and there's a chasm between the two which is a problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Then we have grandma, mum, aunties, uncles, that sort of thing. They are not qualified childcare educators, and yet we have the childcare educators saying what a wonderful job they're doing, how important it is that taxpayers should pay for the job they're doing, and how important it is that all those qualifications that they've got be respected by higher pay and all that sort of stuff. And, I mean, the ultimate conclusion you would come to is that they are arguing that mums shouldn't be allowed to look after their own kids because they're not qualified enough. And I raised that during the committee hearing, and some people recoiled and said, oh, well, no, that's not what we really mean. And yet, what other conclusion can you come to other than qualifications are good? They're so good, in fact, that taxpayers should pay for them. We're doing wonderful things for these little kids with their early education, and kids who miss out on it are basically deprived.
Yeah. I mean, are we overcomplicating this a bit, though? I mean, particularly around rhetoric. We now call all of this early childhood education. Once upon a time, it was called childcare. I mean, is this also part of the problem? When you start using rhetoric like this, automatically you'd start demanding higher financial investment.
Yeah, well, one of the justifications used all the time for by the early childhood educators is the great start they're giving kids, their little kids, in these childcare centres, and how important early childhood education is. And that's fine. It's quite likely that there is a basis for that argument to say, well, early childhood education will give kids a start in literacy and numeracy and all those sorts of things, and they'll settle into school earlier. The question is, if they don't have that, are they deprived? And they don't get that if they stay home with mum most of the time. And the other thing is, if it's not that important that mums should do that mums can't be allowed to look after their own kids, then the question arises, who should pay for it? Because it's basically a voluntary. It's a choice.
And we have finite resources. Now, just before you go, one last thing here. Childcare workers, again, I see thousands of them set to strike across Australia. They're going to walk off the job again next month. I think they did this a few months ago. This is part of this push to persuade the federal government to increase their pay. I mean, you and I both agree. It's the workers, predominantly female, again, in this industry, are not the cost burden really here. I mean, they're not getting paid a king's ransom to do their job. They work hard, long hours. They're with young kids. It's not everyone's ideal job, but they do it, and we thank them for it. And I'd argue maybe we should even pay them more. But at the end of the day, where is the bulk of the cost coming from? As I said, some people are paying, if they send a kid 5 days a week to childcare, paying more than if they sent a 15-year-old to the top Protestant school in the city or Catholic school in the city. So, which is completely nuts. Where is the bulk of the cost coming from? Because it's not the wages, really, of the 4, 5, 6 women that work in the centre.
It is the wages in aggregate. It's not the wages per employee, per woman who works, or childcare worker, usually women, but it is in aggregate because of these ratios that you have to have 1 per 4 children in childcare and 1 per 5 once they're above a certain age.
I think 1 to 10 for preschoolers, yeah.
10, yeah,
older,
something like that. Now, those ratios, they have no basis in evidence. They're just agreed by people who say, oh, that sounds like a nice number. But in aggregate, you end up, if it's a reasonable sized childcare centre, you have to employ a lot of people. And the cost of those lot of people is the bulk of the cost that the childcare centres have to pay. And because the childcare workers are saying, well, we're also qualified, we've got certificates at a minimum or degrees, depending on how many kids they supervise, how many employees they supervise. They want to be paid even more. It adds up. And cost of labour, cost of staff is by far the biggest cost of childcare centres.
Look, it's always good to talk, David, and I thank you for your analysis this morning. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Senator David Leyonhjelm.